North American children live in an environment where they are by themselves from a very early age and must cry out to their parents when they have needs that need to be taken care of. So that's the way we do it in North America. We're not with our children all the time. We house them in a different room than us. Remember? And you guys agreed with that. If you were going to configure a house with 3 bedrooms and a mommy and a daddy, and I don't know, there were 4 or 5 kids, you would put your kids in a separate room. We put our babies in a separate room. But most of the world doesn't do that. They house their babies with the mother. Children from many other cultures, in contrast, may live in an environment where their mother is always around. Not always. Remember, the Cameroonians, they never put their kids down. They always have contact with their babies, with their children. Often, as in many cultures, the children are literally carried by their mother throughout the day. Mothers do not need to be called to, as they are always present to respond to the child's needs. Okay, so in North America we do it one way. In the rest of the world they pretty much do it a completely different way. They're always in contact with their children. And for that reason, of course, they don't have to worry about calling their mother. But at the same time, their brains develop differently because they don't develop autonomy as readily as we do in North America. So what's better, autonomy or taking care of your children, making sure your children are taken care of all the time? What this actually does, it changes the type of parenting style that these select individuals maintain. In 1971, Baumrind came up with 3 different types of parenting. One type of parenting is referred to as authoritarian parenting. And of course, in 1971, this was right after, it was during the Vietnam War, but it was right after the Korean War, right after World War II, right after almost all the parents were Depression-era parents. And for that reason, there was an awful lot of authoritarian parenting taking place. Not only that, but the psychologists at the time were authoritarians. Watson said that the way you need to raise your child is not give them any affection, because if you give them affection, it will spoil them. So the authoritarian form of parenting was very common. It was not only common in the United States, but it was also common in Europe. So the children in Europe were growing up with these very strict parents that didn't give them any affection. And the psychologists were supporting this. Watson supported this. Freud kind of supported this. But all of the Skinner supported this. He came up with a concept of the Skinner box. You raise your child as if he were a specimen, as if your child were a specimen. And so you didn't give them affection, because if you gave them affection, it would cause them to be spoiled. The authoritarian parenting, low levels of warmth or responsiveness by the parents to the child's protests. So there's not a whole lot of warmth taking place, but you're very strict with your children. The best type of parenting, of course, this came out of the 1970s. So there were parents out there that were Rogerian, that were humanitarians. They felt that you needed to focus on the child. It was a child-centered approach. Parents maintain a high expectation of maturity for their children. They show them affection, but at the same time they are strict. Children need direction. That was the idea. But at the same time they need affection. With the authoritarian parenting, they got direction, but they got no warmth. But with the authoritative parenting, of course, they got affection with direction. Permissive parenting, parents are very involved with their children, much expressed parental warmth and responsiveness. So these individuals were taking care of the children. The problem was that the children had no direction, and that's permissive parenting. They placed very few limits or controls on the children, and the question is, so how in the world did all of these children end up? Which ones became model citizens in the United States? Well, the permissive parenting didn't really work very well because the children had no direction. So they were just scattered all over the place. They were in charge. And of course, they didn't have the maturity to actually run the family. So a lot of times they did whatever the hell they wanted to do, and usually it had to do with dating at 12 and getting pregnant at 14 and taking drugs and whatnot, because the parents had no control over them. They didn't want to have control over them. So these kids didn't turn out very well. With the authoritarian parenting, the children usually rebelled about at the beginning of their adulthood. They rebelled against their parents. And they were also angry with their parents. So these are the ones that needed a lot of counseling. These guys needed counseling, these guys needed counseling. These were the only ones that didn't need counseling, the authoritative parenting. So these are the ones that turned out the best. And this is in 1971, of course. That was a long, long time ago. It's like 50 years ago, 1971. Well, that's 48 years ago. I graduated from college in 1971. And my 50th reunion is in 2 years, so I guess that's the way it works. I think. That's not right. That's not right. This is 17, isn't it? It'll be 18. So in 21, it'll be 50 years. Really? Okay. Parenting styles, while Western parents are more demonstrative than most other parents, Chow in 1994 argues that training is a core part of Chinese parenting. Chinese parents are very much more authoritarian than we are in the United States. But of course, as far as they're concerned, it's hard work being a good parent, because you have to stay on top of your children all the time. You can't be nice to your children. You need to train them to be good citizens, and that's the way the Chinese do it. It is an effort to have the children adhere to socially desired behaviors, often by providing the child with explicit examples of proper behavior, and it entails much devotion and sacrifice on the part of the parents. So if you're a Chinese parent, it is very difficult for you to work. The father works, but the mother has to be home parenting her children, because she has to stay on top of them all the time. She has to tell them what to do. It's hard work being a good Chinese parent. Now, as you can understand, the Chinese have 1.5 billion people in their country. Their country is smaller than the United States. That's really crowded situation. That's a really crowded situation. And the Chinese have had not that many people, of course, but their country has been overcrowded for an extended length of time, for thousands and thousands of years. So social control is extremely important. Without social control, they would implode. So they need social control. So they need their children to be good citizens, always good citizens, and always do the right thing. They have to always do the right thing. If they do the wrong thing, then the whole society collapses. So they're collectivists. They have to be collectivists because it's such a crowded situation. And that's one of the reasons why Asia has so many collectivist countries. Korea, Japan, China. All of these are collectivist countries because they're crowded. Japan doesn't have that many people, but it's not that big an island either. Not only is it not that big an island, but only 30% of the island is inhabitable. The rest of it is mountains, volcanic mountains. It would be like everybody trying to live on, just north of here, on those mountains. Well, you couldn't do it because there's too much up and down and not enough of this stuff. So you wouldn't be able to do it. And that's the way it is in Japan. But they're volcanic mountains. They're not like these mountains. They're volcanic mountains. So it's really rough rock, and it's something that you can't build on. You can't walk on because it's volcanic, and it will cut your feet all up. You'll cut your shoes all up. Anyway, so that's the way the Chinese parents do things. So we talk about the tiger mom, the Chinese tiger mom, all the time. Contrary to Western findings, strong parental control has been found to be associated with increased family cohesion, perceived parental warmth and acceptance, and better academic achievement in China, Japan, and Korea. So their kids are smarter than ours are. Their families are stronger than our families are. There's more warmth and acceptance in the family. They do what their parents tell them to do. And they accept that. but the mother is very, very, doesn't show a lot of warmth, but she has a lot of control. There's a lot of parental control in their families. The European American high school students viewed any pressure by their mother to be largely negative, so they read it as being negative and indicative that they didn't feel supported by their mother because their mother was trying to tell them what to do. However, Asian American high school students didn't view maternal pressure in negative terms. And we're going to talk about how they feel, how these individuals feel. They feel that if their mother doesn't try to control them, that she doesn't love them. That's the way they feel. Americans, the very opposite. European Americans, the very opposite. They feel that if their mother is trying to control them, then it's a negative thing. But Asians feel that if their mother isn't trying to control them, then she doesn't really love them. We're going to say that in just a second. When Asian American students reflected on their mother pressuring them to work hard on a task, they were more motivated to complete a task on their own. However, European American children, if their mother tried to pressure them to do something, they would not do it at all. They would rebel. But Asian American students, they need that pressure, and they feel loved when they get that pressure. Japanese adolescents even feel rejected by their parents when they experience only little parental control and broader range of autonomy. So the more autonomy they feel, the more rejected they feel, because they feel like their parents don't control them or aren't trying to control them. Therefore, they must not love me if they're not trying to control me. Does all that make sense? So we're getting an opposite reaction here. It's really kind of interesting that as American children, we seek autonomy, and as Asian children, if they get autonomy, they feel rejected. Now, as an American parent, of course, that's the way I raise my children, to go off and leave the house at 18 and go to college, and then find a job and become completely autonomous. So that of course, we were moving around at the time. We were in the military at the time, so them following us around would have been difficult. For one thing, the military wouldn't have paid for them because they wouldn't have been dependents. So they would have just lived in our houses, but we wouldn't have been able to claim them as dependents. However, authoritarian parenting styles are defined by Baumrind in 1971, have been found to be associated with more stressed mothers and to lead to increased psychological maladjustment among children across a variety of both Western and non-Western cultures, including the Chinese. So the more authoritarian they are, even among the Chinese, the more negative it is, even with the Chinese, as confusing as that is. In general, children are less happy with strongly controlling parents, and this effect is found across many cultures. Okay, so the more you try to control them, the more they don't like it. And the more likely they're going to have psychological problems. There are obvious differences between parenting philosophies of North American and Chinese parents. North American children come to learn that they are independent agents to which their mothers respond, whereas Chinese children learn that they are relational beings who need to respond to their mothers. I was watching My Big Fat Greek Wedding last night, which was kind of interesting. So she's Greek, and she's being controlled by her parents, by her father and by her mother. Here she is, 30 years old, and she's dating this non-Greek individual, and her father is deciding whether she can do it or not. And she's 30 years old. Is he authoritarian? No, she doesn't. He's more like a Chinese parent, because him showing his desire to make sure that everything turns out okay as far as she's concerned shows affection as far as she's concerned. So she doesn't really reject him. Eventually she marries the guy. Of course she marries whoever she wants to marry. But it's really kind of interesting watching that movie and then giving this lecture. I just watched this last night. Okay, this is a joke, but it's not really that funny. This is a free country, so which will it be? Piano or violin? You won second place. Second place is first place for losers. That's what the mother says. No, you can't go to the prom, but we can drive past on the way to Stanley Kaplan. And I'm not exactly sure what Stanley Kaplan is. I was going to look it up last night and I didn't. Garbage, I call you that because I love you. Garbage, okay. So yeah, Chinese women, or Chinese mothers are fairly strict with their children. North American mothers are more likely to discuss their children's success and positive emotional experiences with them, thereby emphasizing what the child is able to accomplish. And this is how we do it. This is how we do it. Oh, that's a song I heard last night. So, okay. Anyway, okay, so what else is happening here? However, Chinese mothers are most likely to call attention to their children's mistakes and their transgressions, thereby elaborating on how the child needs to change to fit in better. Remember, this is collectivistic. This is a collectivistic society. They need to be able to get along with everybody else. So the mother doesn't want them to stick out. She doesn't want the nail to be out of the wood. And if it's out of the wood, she has to hammer it down. Because this is a very crowded society as far as she's concerned. It's the Chinese society. It's very crowded. So they have to do what they need to do in order for them to survive in that crowded environment. In the United States, of course, we have all this wide open spaces. So we can be autonomous. But the Chinese, it's not that way. Everything is crowded in China. Everything's crowded in Japan. Of course, nobody's been to Japan, but if you had ever been to Japan, it's really kind of fascinating because they have gardens. And you go out into these gardens, and the garden will be about the size of this room. And you will take a path, a winding path, and you'll go past sand pits that are raked in a certain direction. And as you're walking along these paths, this is the only time you get to be alone. You can meditate in this garden. And the garden's only this size. But of course, outside is traffic and people and subways and buses and cars and messes, all kinds of messes. But inside, of course, and it's only the size of this room, but you're following this path and you're thinking about, all of the marks that have been made in the sand and whatnot. And this rock, it's a blue rock. Yeah, so it's meditation. But you have no opportunity to be alone. So the only way that you can maintain yourself is to be alone up here. So that's why they need to meditate. But we don't do that in the United States. If I want to be alone, I just go outside and walk in the back of the Hogan housing with my dog. I can walk back there. There's nobody back there. Sometimes a cow will go on the other side of the fence. This morning there were 2 horses out there. Anyway, but in China and Japan, you can't be alone. There is no alone. So the autonomy has to be up here. And that's what the Chinese mother is trying to teach her child. This really gets interesting because when we talk about different cultures, we also have to talk about their language and how their language is put together. This is really kind of fascinating. Around the age of 18 months, young children enter a period of accelerated word learning when their vocabularies begin to increase dramatically at about 18 months. And if you've ever been around an 18-month-old, wow, they'll pick up any word, so don't let Uncle Johnny, drop F-bombs all over the house, because all of a sudden that 18-month-old is going to be repeating those F-bombs all over the place. A great deal of research has indicated that this increase in vocabulary is not distributed equally across all different forms of words. the words that they pick up, and this is really kind of fascinating, the words they pick up mostly are nouns. The English language is based on nouns, and this is the way that the best way for us to learn languages are to learn the nouns and then you learn the verbs. But of course, that's not the way they teach. They try to teach you conversational languages, or they try to teach you a language conversationally, and you can't just use nouns. But the best way to learn a language is to learn the nouns first and then add the verbs later. But learn all the nouns. Learn the noun for horse. What is the word for horse? What's the word for cat? What's the word for barrel? What's the word for car? You need to learn all the nouns. There is a great deal of evidence that North American children tend to learn nouns much quicker than verbs. Why? Because those are the words that they focus on. They skip over the verbs. And actually, when they start speaking, they will start speaking in single words. And this is known as, I can't remember what the word is. It has to do with holism. Anyway, one word meaning a whole bunch of stuff. Chinese children, on the other hand, were found to use more verbs than nouns. There is no noun bias among Korean toddlers, but North Americans, because we speak English, of course, nouns are dominant. With Chinese, verbs are dominant, and with the Koreans, neither one is dominant, because the Korean language is different from the Chinese language. It's Hangul, it's a different language. The structure of English is such that nouns tend to come in rather salient locations, such as the end of sentences. So we start out our sentence with the noun and we end our sentence with the noun. We have our subject and we have our predicate. And in the predicate, the most important word is the noun. It's not the adjective, it's not the adverb, it's the noun. So nouns are the most important words in the English language. East Asian languages, such as Japanese and Korean, tend to place verbs in salient positions at the end of sentences. We don't put our nouns at the ends of sentences. We put we don't put our verbs at the ends of sentences. We put them in the middle. So when we create a sentence, we have a noun, a verb, and then a noun at the end. So there are two nouns in there, and those are the most important words in the sentence. But in Chinese and in Japanese and Korean, the verbs are at the end of sentences. With the Romance languages, they're at the ends of sentences. If you learn Latin, then the verb will be at the end. Okay. Unlike in English, the Chinese, Japanese, and Korean languages allow for nouns and pronouns to be dropped when the context is clear. In other words, if you're saying something about a bus, and it's obvious that you're talking about the bus, you won't even mention the bus. You won't even use the word bus. They just drop it out of the sentence. So sometimes their sentences are just made up of verbs. There are no nouns in it because everybody understands what they're talking about. In English, we don't do that. We never leave a word out. We can't just drop a word. But in Chinese, Japanese, and Korean, we can they drop nouns very frequently. And for this reason, it's very difficult to understand what they're talking about if you're American. Because as English speakers, we expect them to use all the words that they need in order to give us the information. But they will leave words out. They'll also leave off the ends of words. Anytime a U comes at the end of a Japanese word, they don't pronounce it. Even though it's a vowel, they leave it off. So it's not a Suzu. It's a Suz. It's not Sudoku. Isn't that the way you pronounce it? Sudoku. It's Sudok. They don't pronounce the last U. So a Suzu is not a Suzu. A Suzu in Japan is a Suz. They don't pronounce the last U, as confusing as that is. I know, they drive me crazy. Why put it there if it's that what they do is they overpronounce the last consonant. So it's a Suz. They overpronounce it because it has a U at the end. Westerners tend to perceive the world in a more analytic fashion, seeing objects as discrete and separate, whereas East Asians are more likely to perceive the world in holistic terms, stressing the relations between objects. Now remember, they're always looking for relations between things. So as English speakers, we analyze things more. We are noun dominant. So we are more likely to analyze things. They're looking for a connection between things. So we're looking for more absolutes. We are trying to analyze things to find out the absolute answer. And they're always trying to tie things together. So when they in a class like this, they would be trying to tie everything together. And here we're trying to find rules, specific rules, because we're not noun dominant and they're verb dominant. So our knowledge base is completely different. They're always trying to tie everything together. So as an American, I'm looking for an answer. I'm looking for a specific answer. And they're still trying to tie everything together. So their way of looking at things is completely different. And it has to do with their language, and it has to do with their mindset. It is plausible that the cultural differences in noun bias reflect this difference in thinking about the world. And of course, we are more analytic than they are, and they are more holistic. So they're always trying to tie everything together. This gets kind of interesting when we're talking about research. You know, Sarah's teaching research methods. As an American, as somebody from North America, we're trying to find a rule. We're trying to do research that gives us specific answers, and they're trying to tie everything together. So if we read research from China, if we read research from Japan or Korea, they're looking for different things than we are. We're trying to analyze everything, trying to find one answer, and they're trying to tie everything together. So our research is completely different. Ours is more individualistic. It's more analytic. It's more absolute. And theirs, of course, is more holistic. So can we read their research? Yes, of course we can read their research. But are we going to find the same things? Probably not. We're trying to find an answer. So our abstract is going to be relatively short. This is what we found. Their abstracts are going to be pages long, and the reason is because they're tying everything together. They're trying to tie everything together. They're trying to find something in general. We're trying to find something that's specific. Japanese toddlers have been shown to have fewer demands on their parents than their American counterparts and are less likely to assert their disobedience. Those occasions when Japanese toddlers do act unruly tend to be viewed as signs of blossoming individuality, but rather as indicators of their immaturity. So we see it as them trying to be independent, and we like that because we want our children out of the damn house at 18. By God, they better get out of that damn house. But the Japanese don't see it that way. If the child is disobedient, if they wear their hair funny, they see it as an act of immaturity. They see them as being childish, as being more childish, and we see them as being more adult. Why are they smoking cigarettes at age 5? Why? We see it as, oh, they're just trying to be independent. They see it as them them being more immature. So we would read it as autonomous, as them being independent, and they would see it as the very opposite, as being immature. As interesting as that is. The developmental goal embraced by Japanese parents is much less a desire to see their children learn how to individuate and assert themselves than it is for them to learn how to accommodate to others and to become part of a harmonious social group. So we want our children to be autonomous, and they want their children to be part of a group. So the best Japanese child or the best Chinese child is the one that acts like everybody else. We want our children to be unique because we're Westerners, we're individualists. That's the way we see things. So we're completely different. Our good children are the ones that are standing above the rest of the children. They are unique, and they are our favorite children. But to the Chinese, that child would be disruptive. So their favorite child is the one that is the quiet child. It's the one that society accepts the most. They don't want a tall child. They want all of their children to be exactly the same height. We want our children to be unique. We want them to be the best football player, the best baseball player. And they don't want their children to stand out at all. Many cultures demonstrated tendencies for adolescents to act in the rebellious ways familiar to the West. However, this was by no means universal. Rather, expectations for such antisocial behaviors were present in only 44% of societies with respect to boys, and only 18% of societies for girls. So we are different than everybody else in the world. Almost everybody else in the world wants their boys not to be rebellious at all. 56% of them want them to be just like everybody else in the area. They don't want them to misbehave. As Americans, of course, we see this as them standing out, them being unique. And it's even worse for girls. 82% didn't want their little girls to be rebellious. Only 18% of them saw this type of behavior as a positive. The majority of the culture studied did not expect adolescents to behave especially disobediently. The notion that adolescence is universally associated with violence received little support. Rather, only 13% of societies expected adolescent boys to occasionally be violent, and only 3% of societies had such expectations for girls. Can you think of any society that wants their boys to be violent? Well, that's North America. We're already part of that 13%. We already know that. Okay. Societies that accept violence in adolescent boys. The only one I can really think of is England, where they go crazy over soccer. And they have what is known as hooliganism, where these kids will trash a neighborhood because their team lost or their team won. It all depends on whether they won or lost. They'll just trash it anyway. These people get in street fights over soccer, as fascinating as that is. Where do we want our little girls to look like this? Is this acceptable? Well, it certainly wouldn't be acceptable in Japan or China or Korea, but in the United States, we're not going to reject a child that shaves half of her head and has piercings all on the inner eyebrow. And let's see, she's got spikes on her clothes. This is actually not a picture from the United States. It's actually a picture from England. English tend to be relatively rebellious, just like we are in the United States. But we're not nearly as bad as they are, to some extent. Okay. The experiences of adolescents in Germany, Scotland, Japan, Bali, and Batak were compared, and the results indicated that both individualism and modernity seem to increase the difficulties in adolescence. So they have more problems in England than we do in the United States. For the longest time in Germany, they had a problem with skinheads. You guys understand what skinheads are? They shave their heads. Of course they shave their heads. They were right-wing neo-Nazi groups. And this was really serious in Germany for a long time. It has gotten... And now these guys are older, and they've elected 1/3 of the parliament in Germany is actually this neo-Nazi right-wing. They're headed back to Nazism, is the way it looks in Germany. They didn't win the last election, but they garnered more votes than they've ever garnered before. They had twice as many votes as the last time they voted in Germany. So this looks like a direction that Germany is taking. In particular, there appears to be more conflict between children and their parents in individualistic societies, where children seem to view parental control as a constraint that they must resist. And of course, that's the United States. Obviously, that's the United States. There seems to be increased adolescent distress, especially due to the sheer range of opportunities that confront children as societies industrialize and become more urbanized. One task in adolescence is to learn how to accept adult roles. This is much more straightforward when there are fewer role distinctions and when youths are more in contact with adults as they are in more traditional agricultural societies. How do you learn to be an adult? How do you learn to herd sheep? How do you know how to herd sheep? I have people coming to my office and sometimes they ask for money, or they're trying to sell me something. That happens. But then they tell me about their sheep and their horses. I'm going, I don't know anything. Sheep stink, don't they? They smell bad. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Don't they? Oh, you're from Montana. What do you know about sheep?
There is some big sheep farms up there.
And is that true? On the Blackfeet Reservation?
No.
You guys raise beef.
Yeah, but I have my own sheep.
You do?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, of course, you've been down here for a while.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. You've got your own sheep?
Mm-hmm.
They stink.
I know.
Oh, jeez. They don't smell nearly as bad as goats. Sheep stink. Sorry. So they keep telling me about sheep farming. Of course, I don't know anything about moving sheep from here to there. I know sheep are stupid. They're not real bright. They have no way of protecting themselves, do they?
No.
They're like little children.
Last week, or 2 weeks ago, over at Land Grant, we had 7 rams over there, and a pack of dogs, 7 dogs, got into there and killed one ram, took the testicles of the other ram, and it was hanging. And then on one side of the ram, right here, it was all cut up. The meat was hanging out and everything, so the Navajo Nation Animal Control came out. They set up traps and then they shot like 6 of them.
6 dogs?
Yeah. Interesting.
I hope that didn't have anything to do with my dog. Or my new dog, she just came to my house. She's starving to death. So evidently she didn't get any ram testicles. I'm guessing she didn't get any ram testicles. She's a female too. It's usually the males that are the ones that are overly aggressive. She has had puppies in the recent past. I'm not sure what that has to do with anything. I think it's horrible if they let the dogs run around. They do. I mean, it's dangerous. It's dangerous for people, for kids. Because dogs will kill kids. Mm-hmm. And they have here on the reservation.
Mm-hmm. But, I mean, there's no way of stopping it.
Sure there is. Of course there's a way to stop it. How did they stop it on Fort Belknap? Michelle, how did they stop all the... And they didn't care on Fort Belknap until they started killing livestock. As soon as they started killing livestock, they cracked down on the dog population. Of course there's a way. You trap them, you castrate them,
There's just so many.
You force people to control their animals. How'd they do that? On Fort Belknap, they said you could only have 2 dogs. So
Fort Belknap's a lot smaller than here, so I think it would be easier to do there.
yeah, it's a much smaller reservation. They just shot them. They just wiped out the population. That's the way you do it. Of course, nobody likes dead dogs. Nobody wants. Who's going to be doing the shooting is the other question. You know. shooting little Fifi is probably not the best thing in the whole wide world. Anyway, that's how they did another film. They started killing the dog, culling the dogs, I guess is what they called it, euthanizing the dogs. The number of choices has continued to grow. I can't even remember why we were talking about sheep. What were we talking? Oh, agricultural societies, that's what. See, now you got me all messed up. The number of choices has continued to grow, which has lengthened the period of adolescence, sometimes referred to as failure to launch or emerging adulthood. We're going to talk more about that right now. The transition to adulthood has been marked by 5 milestones. This is how you become an adult. How do I know that I'm an adult? I complete my schooling, or some schooling. Usually it's a bachelor's degree, or maybe just high school. I leave home, find my own place to live. I become financially independent. I start working and I start taking care of myself. I get married and I have my first child. So as soon as you move out of your house, you get your education, you move out of your house, you get a job, you get married, and you have your first child. Now you're an adult. That's how we know that you're an adult. Okay. When did I have my first child? 19. I was 19 when I had my first child. I got married just before I had my first child. So there you go. So I had 2 of those things were taken care of. I was still in school, unfortunately, at the time. But I was on a scholarship. So eventually I did complete school. I left home. I became financially independent to some extent. I didn't become really financially independent until I joined the military. And then, of course, all the rest of it took place. In the United States in 1960, 77% of the women and 65% of the men had passed all 5 milestones by the age of 30. By the age of 30. When I was in high school, almost everybody got married right out of high school. So you got married at 18. When did you have your first kid? Well, hopefully you had your first kid after you got married. Sometimes you had your first kid before you got married. And that's why you got married. I know, yeah. Shotgun thing. That whole shotgun thing is not a very good idea. But this was in 1967. I graduated from high school in 1967. Half of my class were married before the first year. The other half were going to college and didn't start having babies right away. In 2000, fewer than half of the women and less than 1/3 of the men had done so by this age. 30. They're 30 years old. And they still haven't moved out of their parents' house. They still aren't working, aren't independent. They're still living with their parents. They haven't gotten married yet. In the old days, back in the 1960s, if you weren't married by the time you're 30, you're an old maid. If you're a female, if you're a man, then you're probably messing around. I have a neighbor that wasn't married until he was in his 50s. But he dated a lot. And evidently, he never made any babies. I haven't quite figured that one out yet. Anyway, okay. So look at how things have changed over time. 77% of the women had fulfilled this milestone. 65% of the men had fulfilled this milestone in 1960. 1/3 and 1/2 in 2000. Oh my goodness gracious. 30 years old and they still live with their parents. You don't live with your parents. No, of course you don't. Do you have a 30-year-old that's still living with you?
Me?
Yeah. You're not that old.
No, my kids were out by...
Yeah, you talked about that. You talked about all
Yeah,
your kids.
my son, he turned 18 this year, graduated. I gave him all summer to apply to my college and anywhere he wanted to go.
Did he?
He didn't do it, so in August I applied to CNN for him. I told him you have 1 week to get home because he was doing tournaments all over.
Sure.
And we're packing your stuff, you're moving in with your sister. So he lives with my daughter, which is really good because she can't really have boyfriends or anything, you know, and she's trying to be independent. But,
She can't really have boyfriends. Yeah, I've heard that one before.
yeah, but they live together. She's 22, they both go to school, and they both work.
Oh, there you go. Okay, well, they're adults. Okay, they've fulfilled at least 2 of the miles. 3 of the milestones. They've moved out of the house and they have a job and they're independent. East Asian children spent more days in school, 240 days per year in Japan versus 180 days per year in the United States. And the reason they spend more time in school is because they go to school on Saturday. Half a day. Yeah. So if we went to school 6 days a week and only took Sundays off, and I'm not exactly sure why they take Sundays off, but they do. They go to school on Saturday, but they take Sundays off. We take Sundays off because it's the day of religion as far as Christians are concerned, and most Americans are Christian, are of some ilk of Christian. But in Japan, they're not Christian at all. So why do they take Sundays off? Probably because of the Brits. A greater percentage of class time was devoted to math education in the Asian school day than in the United States, than in America. Asian teachers spent a greater percentage of time lecturing in the classroom compared with their American counterparts, about 90% in Taiwan compared to 46% in the United States. This is something my son complains about all the time. They keep coming up with new ways of teaching mathematics, and it's crap. The best way to do math is to do math. It's for him to show them how to do it and for them to do it, to physically do it. What they want him to do now is this new Kagan model, and they get the kids in groups, and the groups do the mathematics, and then they get up and they present how they did the problem, and then in the end they give each other high fives. You think I'm kidding about the high fives?
What grade is this?
He teaches high school. It's a pile of crap. If you want to learn math, you need to do it on yourself. If you get in a group, then the smartest guy in the group is going to be doing the problem, and everybody else is going to be sitting there not doing jack. And that's exactly what happens.
What if you can't learn math? I mean, what if you have that disability to where you just can't
Very
learn
few
it?
people have that.
I have that disability.
Very few people have that disability.
Yeah.
So I'm going to put you in a group and pretend that you're actually doing something and you're not doing anything. You need to practice. You need to practice doing the math. That's how you do it. You don't put everybody together and let Chris do all the work. We're still going to make Chris do all the work.
Or we'll make Jeff do since he missed class.
Yeah, he did. He missed class, so it's his turn next. These guys do a lot of math, and that's good. They practice. You got to practice, and you got to practice by yourself. Just because Jeff knows how to do it, it's not going to help you out at all.
I know.
I know. That's the Kagan model. The Asian math lessons, approximately 80% of the examples were real world in Japan, and compared with 10% examples of American classes. So when they do mathematics, they solve real world problems. They talk about, Horatio has 15 eggs and he needs to use 3% of them. So what is 3% of 15 eggs? That kind of thing. We don't do that. We don't do these problems. We just throw numbers up there and do those kinds of problems. Asian teachers assigned more homework to students. 5th graders in the United States had less than half as much homework assigned to them as Taiwanese students. These kids sit at home and do homework because they're supposed. That's why they call it homework. You do it at home, damn it. You don't do it in study hall. You do it at home. They don't sit around at home playing video games because they got all their homework done on the bus. Yeah, right. Okay. Playing video games and then watching television until 11 o'clock at night, going to bed, then getting up the next morning and having their homework done in homeroom because they have 2 homerooms during the school period. They do their homework at home and they don't turn on the television until their homework is done. If they ever turn on the television at all. Asian parents are more likely to provide their children with a desk. Really? Is a desk that important? Michelle, you need to make sure that your baby has a desk when it's time. Not at the dinner table. That's where you eat. A desk, so that's where they do their homework. Do you guys have a desk? See? Yeah, you've got desks. So your kids need to learn that that's where they do homework, at their desk. Anyway, desks are very important. My grandson, who's only 5 and in kindergarten, has a desk. Because I told my daughter about this. I taught this last semester, and I told my daughter about this, and she said, you know, Dad, that makes a lot of sense. I got her a desk when she was, a little bitty guy, and she was a 4.0 in high school. So she's really smart. Because she knows where to do her homework. And she knows it's important. To me, it was important to me that she did her schoolwork. So I gave her a place to do her schoolwork. This is where you do your homework. This is where you eat your supper. This is where you watch television. You don't watch television from your desk. You don't eat supper at your desk. You do your homework at your desk. You eat your supper at the table. One study revealed that 98% of Taiwanese 5th graders had a desk in their home, compared to only 63% of American kids. So they had no place to do their homework. No special place. We need to buy them a desk. Stevenson in 1992 asked 5th graders to imagine that there was a wizard who would grant them anything that they wished. About 70% of the wishes listed by Chinese students had to do with education. 70% had to do with education. They wished for success in school or to be able to go to college. That's what the Chinese kids wished for. In contrast, only about 10% of American children wish for things relevant to education. About 10% of the American children wish for less school. Oh my goodness gracious. So education is not very important to people in the United States. The East Asian children are doing much better as a group on math tests than American children. Thus, one might expect East Asian mothers to be especially satisfied with their children's performance, since they do so well. This does not seem to be the case. Rather, the American mothers report being far more satisfied with their children's performance than East Asian mothers. Remember, East Asian mothers tell you what you did wrong, whether you did anything wrong or not. They're trying to make you good citizens, good social citizens. Compared with mothers of first grade children, Chinese and Japanese mothers of 5th grade children reported that a higher standard of achievement was necessary for them to be satisfied with their children's math performance. Okay. In stark contrast, the standards of American mothers was lower for 5th grade children than first grade children. All they want them to do is pass. They don't care what they learn or whether they learn anything at all. We live in a culture today where everybody gets a trophy, whether they won or lost. We have no way of comparing anything with anything else. Everybody wins. Everybody's a winner.
Oh, yeah, I've seen that on the news where everybody's a winner in, oh no, it was a movie. Did you guys see it? Like, they'll do T-ball or something, and everybody gets a trophy.
Everybody gets a trophy.
And parents are starting to get mad. They're like, well, who's the winner,
Right.
Yeah.
Was this for American families?
Yeah. American families. They don't care whether their kids learn anything or not, as long as they get an A. They complain about the grade. They don't care about the knowledge base. They don't care if they learned anything.
Well, isn't that how the standardized testings are? Like, you just mark off true or false. It's not necessarily like...
Oh, you mean you can guess?
Well, not necessarily guessing, but actually just passing the test and actually just knowing what's on the test.
I guess that is always standardized testing, because I never even thought of it that way. But I guess you're right. Interesting. Fascinating. This is depressing, isn't it? It gets worse. It appears that to be far easier to meet standards of American mothers than East Asian mothers, obviously, since East Asian mothers are complaining about everything. This would suggest that American children have less reason to work hard at their studies than East Asian children do. And of course, that's what we have found out. These kids spend hours doing their homework, and American children spend hours playing video games. Numbers are harder to learn in English than in Japanese, Korean, or Chinese because there are more irregular number words in English. So there you go. Now you understand why you're having problems with mathematics. It's the English. If you could learn your mathematics in Chinese, piece of cake. Piece of pie. East Asian counting systems incorporate the base 10 concept, which is necessary for learning how to do multi-digit arithmetic in a more straightforward way than English does. Thus, English speakers need more conceptual support for the base 10 concept than do speakers of East Asian languages. One of the problems we have in English is that we measure things in miles and in feet, rather than using decibels, kilometers and whatnot. If you learn in feet, how long is a foot? 12 inches? What's that all about? Why 12? That's a base 12? Does this make sense? Everything else is in base 10. And here we're measuring miles 5,280 feet. Wait a minute. Why is a mile 5,280 feet? Is that a base 5,280? This doesn't make any sense whatsoever. We measure things in these chunks that makes no sense whatsoever. But if we were doing things in base 10, everything would make a lot more sense. We measure things in centimeters and in millimeters, then it would be easier to understand base 10, because that's a base 10.
Is America the only one who goes by those measurements?
Metric system is used in Canada. They use kilometers up there. The United States, even England uses the metric system. We may be the only country in the world that uses feet and miles, as bizarre as that is. I know, we're so screwed up. Anyway, sorry about that. It wasn't my idea. I've been to a Europe where they measured everything in kilometers. Kilometers are shorter, so they're kind of fun. What time is it? How am I doing? 11:35. Okay. Okay, so let's talk about the self and personality, now that we've attacked the American educational system. I've attacked the American educational system. The 20 statements test is one that of the most widely used cross-cultural psychological measures. I could give you the 20 questions test. It's not very difficult. There are 20 questions and they all start with I am. Then you make 20 statements about yourself. I am Danae. I am tall. I am handsome. I am whatever. 20 statements. It's kind of fascinating. Americans most often mention personal traits, attitudes, and abilities, which accounted for 48% of self-description. So we describe ourselves by who we think we are. We are self-absorbed. We take selfies all the time. I haven't figured out why women do this. They make fishy nut faces, and then they take selfies. Like every time they do this, it doesn't make any sense. Why are they making kissy faces? Do they really want to kissy people? Probably not. Not just anybody, they want to kissy the right person, I'm guessing. The American pattern is similar to many other Western cultures. Australia is the same way, Britain's the same way, Sweden and Canada. All of them, about 48% of their self-description has to do with something individual to them. When other cultural groups were given the same measure, the results were very much different. The Maasai and the Samburu of Kenya had only 2% of their self-descriptions reflect personal characteristics. I am tall, I am handsome, I am Samburu. Usually that was the 2% had to do with them saying what tribe they were from. 60% of their description encompassed their social membership and roles. The Maasai and Samburu pattern of a greater emphasis on roles and membership appears in cultures from much of the rest of the world, and these cultural differences are already evident among kindergarten children. So kindergarten children in all of these different places identify themselves by what they are, not who they are. Or maybe who they are, not what they are. Cook Islanders, Malaysians, Chinese, Native Americans, other Africans other than the Samburu and the Maasai, Puerto Ricans, Indians, people from India, that means, people from Japan. These are Cook Islanders, and that's the reason I put this picture up here, to show you what somebody from the Cook Islands looks like. They look like islanders. They look like somebody from the islands. Puerto Ricans are different than other people in the United States, even though Puerto Rico is part of the United States. Puerto Rico just got blasted twice by 2 hurricanes, one right after the other. The place is a mess.
So are Puerto Ricans like technically United States citizens?
Yes, they are United States citizens, but they don't have to pay taxes.
When did they become citizens?
When we captured the island after the Spanish-American War. We were given the island after the Spanish-American War.
So we don't need a passport to fly to Puerto Rico?
Well, it's part of the United States.
But it's just not counted as an official state.
It's not a state. As a matter of fact, they just voted as to whether to become the 51st state or not, and they voted it down.
When was this?
A couple months ago. It just happened.
Was it their election or?
Ours? Oh no, it's theirs. Of course it was theirs. We can't tell them that they have to become a state. However, if they become a state, it's going to cost them a lot more money. Puerto Rico has a real serious problem, economic problem. And then they got blasted by the hurricane. So they were in default as far as all these loans were concerned before the hurricanes hit. So, and that's part of what's going on. What's going to happen next? We're going to have to bail these people out of their economic problems, and then we're going to have to rebuild the island.
Is that why Trump didn't like submit the supplies and everything?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. So he's getting really weird about this whole thing. He doesn't like the fact that these people don't pay taxes. Like, he hasn't paid taxes in 18 years, so he should care if the whole damn island doesn't pay taxes. I know, this is so weird, isn't it? I mean, it's so very strange. But they speak Spanish. They don't speak no habla español, or no habla inglés. I had a person that I served with in the military, and she was from Puerto Rico. And by golly, that lady had to learn English in basic training. And she picked up English in 6 weeks. She picked up English. And she spoke very, very well. She was working on her master's degree in psychology. And she'd only been speaking English for about 1.5 years. She was an amazing lady. This lady was brilliant. She's Puerto Rican. Fascinating lady, Mercedes. Her name was Mercedes. Mercedes is what her name was. But of course, if you pronounced her name Mercedes, she wouldn't answer. Her name was Mercedes. That's the way you say it in Castilian Spanish, because they speak Castilian Spanish in Puerto Rico, as compared to South American Spanish, which is what they speak in Mexico, what they speak in Central and South America. Anyway, fascinating lady. Keep an eye on the time. A Danish study by Ma et al. In 2012 looked at functional MRIs when participants were evaluating personal characteristics. The Danish participants showed no difference in their functional MRIs when they considered their social roles or their personal characteristics. Both involve the medial prefrontal cortex, which is typically activated in self-judgments. So that's the way the Danish saw their social roles versus their personal characteristics. So they saw themselves, they identified themselves, I'm tall, I'm handsome. You know, this is part of their social role. They saw the two of them together, as stuck together. Just like Americans do, just like those people taking selfies and making the fish lip things. What is that fish lip thing? I don't know, I haven't figured it out. Men don't do it, but women do it. What is that supposed to mean? I've got to figure
Makes
this.
their cheeks thinner.
Dinner? Maybe that's it. Okay, thank you. That's what I was hoping for. Okay. I'm always looking for a woman with thin cheeks.
God, I'm gonna do that no more.
You do that, you're not going to do it anymore. You do it too, don't you?
Sometimes.
Not every time. When the researchers performed the same functional MRI on Chinese participants, their medial prefrontal cortex was only activated when they were considering personal characteristics. When the Chinese thought of their social roles, their temporal parietal junction was activated. This is the region that more typically is involved with understanding other people's beliefs. So if I'm trying to figure out what you believe in, what your religion is, then this part of my brain lights up. If I'm trying to understand why the Germans became Nazis during World War II, this section of my temporal parietal junction lights up if I'm trying to figure out some other individual. Now the Chinese, when they were asked about, what were they asked about? What were we doing? When they were asked about their social role, they were trying to think of how other people see them. Does that make sense? Yeah, that's what they were trying to do. They were trying to see how other people see them. But they were talking about their own social roles. So their idea of social roles has to do with making other people happy or trying to understand what other people want them to do. As Americans, that doesn't happen to us. When we're thinking of our social roles, we're thinking of ourselves. We're more arrogant than they are. We're more individualistic than they are. They're trying to think of how other people are going to react to what they're doing. As Americans, we don't even think about that. Ma et al. In 2012 suggests that Chinese participants were more likely thinking about other people's beliefs when they thought about their own social roles. Though we are all individuals, humans are also a highly social species. Social interaction is a continuous balancing act between focusing on our differences and seeking our connection with others. So who are we? We are not only ourselves, but we are also our social selves. We are also connected with other individuals. So if we think of ourselves and we're part of a gang, well, potentially we think of ourselves as part of that gang. That is our identity. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. No? I can only think of myself as part of this group, so I can never separate myself completely from this group. Because I am part of that group, and that group is very strong as far as my identity is concerned. This is kind of an interesting picture. What this guy has done is pre-imposed his own face on other people's bodies, is what he's done. And so it's all the same guy. Isn't that fascinating? Can you tell me where this guy is from? Just by looking at his face.
Japan, Chinese, China.
I've got China and Japan. And neither one of them are right. His head's kind of square. It's kind of rectangular. If you see somebody from Japan, they have their faces are angled.
Korean?
Yeah, he's Korean. He looks so Korean. He looks so Korean. The Korean bodies are, I shouldn't even talk about people's bodies. Anyway, the Koreans look different than the Japanese and the Chinese, usually. Chinese have round faces, kind of ovular faces. The Japanese have angular faces, almost triangular shaped faces. And the Koreans have rectangular faces. It's not important. It's not important unless somebody's shooting at you, okay? And then you want to know who that guy is. And actually, these guys were our allies in Vietnam. The Koreans were. Boy, they didn't mess around. They just killed people. They were really good at it. We're Americans. We're trying to figure out whether these are good guys or bad guys. The Koreans are just wiping them all out. Marcus and Kitayama first identified the independent view of the self in 1991. Independent individuals experience their identities as largely distinct from their relationships. Independent individuals are self-defining. Their attitudes are self-defining, their personality traits, their preferences, their opinions, their abilities, and their individual qualities. All of these are independent, are self-defining and individualistic. The self's experiences are rather stable and does not change much from situation to situation. The independent view of self is experienced as self-contained and exists as a relatively coherent and inviolate entity. Relationships vary and are fluid as individuals tend to be closer to close relationships than distant ones. In other words, if you're an individualist, no matter what happens to you, you'll always feel the same. Relationships don't change who you are. You will always be that select individual. A good example is my big fat Greek wedding. Despite the fact that she married a non-Greek man, oh my God, this relationship, so did this relationship change her? No, she was still a Greek. She still felt as the child of this man, the daughter of this man, of this woman, the sister of all these brothers. She still felt part of the family. It didn't change her identity at all, despite the fact she married a non-Greek. Because she was an individualist. She maintained that same identity of self. Her relationships did not change who she was. However, as we're going to find out, as we're going to find out, as Asians, they have much smaller friendship pools. They have fewer friends because their relationships identify them. But as individuals, our relationships don't identify us. I talk about my 3 marriages all the time. My relationships didn't change who I am, despite the fact that I was married to all 3 of these women. Not the same. And I only married one of them. And I've been married for 38 years. Okay. But that relationship didn't change who I am. I'm still the same person I was before. Okay, I'll see you guys next week. Well, this has been a lot of fun. I had a good time today. I had a great time today. Thanks. Whew. And now I'm done for the week. I can take the rest of the weekend off. Go home and see if I still have a dog. Or if the tribal police have come and shot her for eating.
So you know what
Eating
you were
rams.
saying in Psychology 1, how we identify with the white and the black culture, like the skin tone and hair. I see myself, I do that. I really do that because I can see myself.
As well you should. I mean, we're all ourselves, and we should identify ourselves by our relationship. And the sad thing is that I was just watching, what was that movie I was watching? Hidden Figures.